Welcome to the Ballot Brief, a podcast series of interviews with Democratic gubernatorial candidates ahead of the August 11th primary. I want to welcome our listeners and thank our media sponsor, Home Tech by Mosaic. I also want to thank our guest, current state senator and Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Kelda Roys. Kelda, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me and connect with Eau Claire's business community on the issues that matter to our region.
Great to be with you, Erica.
The idea of speaking directly to the candidate eliminates the need to rely solely on the campaign advertisements, headlines, or secondhand interpretations of a candidate's position. We represent a lot of working people, a lot of so the idea of this is to eliminate the middleman. As a Chamber of Commerce, we work to provide our investors with nonpartisan information on candidates with the further aim of increasing engagement in government and politics from our local business communities. A quick disclaimer before we get started for any listeners, at no point in this series is the Chamber going to endorse candidates in any race. We are supportive of policies that equip our region with the resources we need to support business and sustain our growth. So I guess before we dive into specific policy areas, I wanted to start with a broad question. This isn't a pop quiz, but I just wanted to get your take about what your priorities ahead of being elected potentially as governor in November. Based on your understanding of Eau Claire and the broader Chippewa Valley, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing our business community today?
I think the biggest challenge facing Wisconsin overall, and I think this is doubly true for the business community, is the rising cost of goods and services. It's the affordability crisis. And when you're running a business, particularly a smaller business, your margins are pretty tight. And so to have skyrocketing energy costs, or to have employees losing childcare, or to have your labor force undermined by, attacks on immigrant families, all of these things can really destabilize your business and our economy overall. And that's why one of our most important tasks for our next governor is to help protect Wisconsin from the dangerous policies of the Trump regime.
So, sourced from roundtables, committees, and simple conversation, our recurring themes are, you mentioned workforce, healthcare, funding from the state in general, housing affordability, also just affordability in general, education, and also you mentioned energy. I'd like to take some time to dive deeper into all of these. I know that's very ambitious, but so for listeners ranging from either those that only recognize your name as a contender for governor, to those who followed your career in the Capitol closely, what sets you apart from the other six candidates, and why would you be the best nominee for governor on behalf of the Democratic Party?
I would say the three big things that set me apart are experience. I have more experience in and around state government than any other candidate running, including the only candidate with that critical experience on the state budget through my service on the Joint Finance Committee. Number two is effectiveness. We're going to be in a situation where we either have split legislative control or we may have a narrow Democratic trifecta. I've been working in these really tough legislative environments, not just as a legislator, but as an advocate, as a small business owner, as an attorney for over 20 years. And I've been able to actually pass policies and get things done on a bipartisan basis in this really tough environment. No other candidate can say that. And I've actually, passed bills for more than 2 decades in this really tough environment. So turning progressive ideas and pragmatic ideas into law, that's really important experience. And third, I would say is electability. Wisconsin voters value independent thinkers. And the Democratic nominee is going to be going up against Tom Tiffany. Tom's got some very effective, slick ads that are trying to make him out to be a moderate. And the truth is, Tom Tiffany has voted with Donald Trump 100% of the time, and he is not his own man. I'm a Democrat, and I'm proud of my values. I have also never hesitated to stand up to other Democrats or party leaders when I thought that they were wrong. And I think that voters in the general election are really going to value that, especially in a governor, where you don't want somebody that's just going to do whatever a special interest tells them to do or whatever the big money donors want. I'm somebody who was one of the first candidates in the country to say, I'm not going to fund my campaigns with corporate PAC money. I want to be funded by grassroots Wisconsinites, and my campaign is. And I think Wisconsin voters are going to respond to that, especially in stark contrast to Tom Tiffany, who has never met a special interest that he wasn't willing to carry water for.
So you mentioned bipartisan victories. Do you have any specific examples that you could share with our listeners, either from your career or?
Sure, we could probably spend the whole podcast just going through all the different things I've worked on, but I'll just highlight a couple. In law school, I worked on the Innocence Project, and I helped to pass criminal justice reforms to help prevent wrongful conviction, working with some of the most conservative legislators in the state. When I was the executive director of a statewide reproductive rights organization, I helped to pass the first pro-choice legislation that had passed in 30 years in Wisconsin through an anti-abortion Republican-controlled assembly. So when I say I know how to actually pass legislation in tough environments, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And then just last year, this is really critical to Western Wisconsin, to your listeners. We know we have a crisis in rural healthcare access, and Western Wisconsin, particularly Northwestern Wisconsin, has borne the brunt of some of these terrible provider losses and hospital closures. I was, for many years, the only Democrat on a bill to expand access to healthcare by letting nurse practitioners practice to the full scope of their training and their expertise. And the governor, our Democratic governor, actually vetoed this bill several times. And I'm really proud that last summer we finally got it across the finish line, just in the nick of time, because we know we have a huge provider shortage in Wisconsin, particularly in northern Wisconsin, including where I'm from, up in Taylor County. And if we don't get more providers online, people are not going to have access to healthcare. So I'm really proud of that one.
Absolutely. So a big aim of this podcast is also to give our listeners the ability to see the difference between all of the candidates, because it's kind of hard moving into a primary with so many people still on the ballot. Additionally, curious what's maybe give me one example of an issue where you would significantly differ than the current Democratic governor, Tony Evers, or something that you would have approached differently. And we will get into the surplus deal eventually, so maybe one different than that.
Sure. Well, I guess I could give an example that's really central to my campaign and my experience as a public school grad and a mom and stepmom of 5, all of whom were, are, or will be in public school. I really think that this private voucher scheme is harming our public education system. And this is an area where I differ not only from the current governor, but from several of the other Democrats in the race. I don't think that public dollars should ever be used to fund private schools. I think that those dollars belong in our public schools. And I have a 3-step plan to bring that voucher program to a responsible end, not overnight, but we can end the wealthy subsidies that families are getting who already had their kids in private school before the state started picking up the tab. We can bring and require accountability and transparency and non-discrimination to eliminate a lot of the big bad actor voucher programs overnight. And then for Milwaukee and Racine, we can phase those out over time as we expand the quality and the capacity of public schools. For me, making Wisconsin the very best place for public education, as it was when I was a child, is my most important job as governor. If we're not investing in our kids, what are we even doing? And it's K-12, but it's also early childhood education. It's also reinvesting in public higher education. And this is something that I think is non-negotiable. If we want Wisconsin to have a strong economy, if we want it to be a place where young people decide they're going to build their careers and their lives and their families and set down roots, we've got to make Wisconsin the public education state again.
Absolutely. And education is a huge issue for our business owners as well, because it has such a large impact on our growing workforce or lack thereof. Whether that's through public schools or private schools, really, we just need places to send our kids where they get what they need. And so that's been something our region has definitely been focused on as well. So we are appreciative of that. I'm going to kind of switch gears. I had mentioned previously the surplus deal, and the failure of that, kind of getting your take on where you fell in that scenario. So voters have heard many different stories from both sides about what might have happened, and they're looking for relief, whether short term or long term. From your perspective, just kind of what happened.
Well, let's set aside the stories and the propaganda and let's actually look at the facts on the ground. I believe that my most important responsibility as a senator is to make good long-term decisions for the state of Wisconsin, even if that means taking a tough vote. And believe me, when you're about to face the voters on August 11th, it would have been the easiest thing in the world for me to just say, hey, did you like your $300 check? Hey, I've just given the average homeowner $107 in one-time property tax relief. Of course, half of homeowners, most of the homeowners probably in your district would have gotten far less than that. Doesn't really touch the property tax issue, but it did have about 300 million of that almost $2 billion package would have gone into our public schools, and they do desperately need it. I well understand that. The cost of doing that deal would have made Wisconsin in a fiscally desperate situation at the end of the next budget. It would have created a $2.9 billion deficit. So for me to basically give the voters a short-term gimmick that could have helped me politically would have created and guaranteed long-term real pain that would necessitate deep cuts in future budgets. And I was not willing to do that. And it's rich to me that the Democrats who stood against this program and stood for fiscal responsibility were being attacked as somehow selfish and politically self-serving, when in fact we did the right thing, even though it was politically hard. And I think that is the kind of responsible decision making that we should expect from our leaders, and most of all from our governor. And I fully believe that we have to make our schools whole from the special education reimbursement that they were promised in the last budget, but that Republicans didn't deliver. And that's why on week one of my governorship, I am going to seek to pass emergency funding to help our school districts right away with that about $300 million that they're short. And I'll also pass money to reauthorize the stewardship program so we can get that back up and running, and to fund early childhood education because we have a childcare crisis. The little bit of money that was put aside in the budget runs out June 30th. And as one of the few legislators who actually has young kids and has daycare costs, that is very personal to me. Our employers cannot afford to see more childcare facilities closing their doors.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to, aside from everything that's been said in the news, when it comes to bipartisanship, what lessons do you think that a split government, and I say that a split government, would take from this? I mean, going into, if you were elected governor in November and there was a divided chambers, I guess
Mm-hmm.
what is a way that you would approach working with them to avoid something like this from happening again in the future?
I think that's a great question, Erica. And throughout my career, I have worked in every different kind of legislative configuration, including a split legislature, and of course, the Republican-dominated legislature that we've had for many years. For me, it's about sitting down and actually listening to people. Right? The governor is not the queen. You don't get to just dictate to people. And I really approach it as we are all elected by the people in the state of Wisconsin to make good decisions. We've got really serious challenges to tackle. It's cost of living. It's how do we raise wages? It's how do we build a better public education system? How do we have vibrant local economies in everywhere in the state, not just the southern part of the state? We can solve these problems together, but you have to really be willing to listen to people, hear where they're coming from, and respect them in these policy discussions. And I think that sometimes becomes lost in our politics because it is so divisive. That's one way that gerrymandering actually really hurts us. It hurts our ability to solve problems because it rewards extremism. And, again, as somebody who's very proud of my democratic values, I'm never going to compromise on, political interference in a woman's right to choose, for instance. But I think that there is always room to listen to and to have conversation and dialogue and work with people who think differently from you. And that's how I've been able to be a very effective legislator and lawmaker, even in these challenging and divisive times.
Mm. Um, Interesting that you mentioned also that um, we don't want to focus most funding on communities in the southern part of the state is because that's a lot of what we've also been dealing with up here. Eau Claire is a very strong community. We don't like to complain about what we don't get from Madison and rather just work with what we have here and see what we can do with it. Um, when it comes to growing areas, Eau Claire is the third fastest growing county in the state, only behind Dane and Trempealeau counties. Um, in your view, what tools do you think that local leaders should have available to close the gap that Madison isn't meeting for us, that they might not have right now, or that they have and
Mm-hmm.
just don't utilize well enough?
The first thing that I think we need to do is to fix our shared revenue formula and put more money into shared revenue. Republican politicians in Madison have been starving local communities of the resources that they need for everything from police and fire and EMS to parks and libraries to business development. Anything that local governments would want to do has been made much more difficult by the levy limits and the lack of the state meeting its funding commitment to local governments. And that's not just an Eau Claire problem, right? That's a statewide problem. It's not just a big city or a rural community problem. It's an everywhere problem. But I'm committed to fixing that because our local communities are the frontline service providers for so many of the critical public services that Wisconsinites need. So it's restoring funding, but it's also restoring local control and autonomy. Republicans in Madison have been really on the warpath for local control, taking away not just taxation authority, but also the ability to make things like housing policy or economic development or workforce policy from local governments and saying, you're not allowed. You were elected by your voters, but you don't actually get to make decisions that are right for your local community. And things are different in Eau Claire than they are in Barron County, right? And so if we want to have a state where communities get to have self-determination, you've got to restore that local control. And then third, I would say, as somebody who has been a successful small business owner, who's seen a lot of ups and downs over my 13 years as an entrepreneur, I am very committed to local economic development that is centered on helping our homegrown entrepreneurs succeed and thrive. I have a robust agenda to do this. And this is a real commitment that I have. I don't believe that you're going to get a dynamic, resilient economy by chasing Foxcons and throwing money at hyperscale data centers. To me, that is the wrong strategy for economic development. The right strategy is doing things like building on my successful Main Street Bounce Back grant program to help new and emerging businesses move into brick and mortar spaces that had been maybe boarded up in retail corridors. That can transform not just the business, but the sense of place, right? When you have these cool new businesses moving in. And, I visited a fly fishing shop in Hayward. And when they went in with this relatively small grant, it transformed the whole downtown. And it led to other businesses moving in. And I've seen that all over the state. And then secondly, for our more high growth startups, I want to have a state fund of funds, which has been a very successful program to help entrepreneurs in our state get the kind of capital that they would otherwise need to go out of state to raise. And then, if they do that, then they're more likely to get poached and leave the state. We don't want that. We want them to be able to raise capital and build their high growth startups here. And so this are things like clean energy tech, medical research, other forms of technology. We have a great video game industry here in Wisconsin, and we want those vibrant businesses that have good paying jobs to stay and grow in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Something that you also mentioned that has been catching a lot of media attention, but local attention across Wisconsin, but also across the United States is data centers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the growing debate everywhere, supporters point to investment, substantial capital for the cities or for municipalities, tax base and construction jobs, and people criticize energy demand, utility costs, water usage,
Mm-hmm.
and general environmental impact. Um,
Mm-hmm.
our chamber and I know neighboring chambers have focused a lot on data centers in this conversation a lot recently. Um, on your website, you've written kind of what you said, that long-term economic growth comes from not attracting things like data centers, but building a healthy ecosystem for entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
where companies can grow. As a governor, how would that philosophy continue to shape Wisconsin's economic development strategy and kind of tying in the data centers? Do you think that those conversations can still be useful with potential data centers that are interested in our state?
Yes, but I think we cannot allow the status quo to continue. I have put forth the strongest plan of any candidate in this race to basically stop this what's happening, which is big data centers, these the rich and most powerful companies in the world coming into local communities, steamrolling them, and we don't have any safeguards as a state. I've co-authored legislation to create very strong statewide standards for labor protections, for environmental protections, especially for our water, to protect local control and transparency, none of these non-disclosure agreements, and to protect ratepayers from having to foot the bill or subsidize in any way these data centers. To me, that's the absolute bare minimum, and we can pass that first thing in January. But that's not enough. We also have to eliminate the subsidies that are going to cost us nearly $2 billion that have been given to data centers to try to bring them to Wisconsin. We should not be paying them. It should be the other way around. They need to be paying us. And that's why I have put forth the idea that we will charge an upfront fee to data center developers. This will stop the speculative developers. So not the Googles or the Metas that actually have a client base and have a use case, but a lot of these data centers are being built by hedge funds on spec with the idea that maybe they'll sell it, and they don't even have the chips secured for them. We don't really, that poses a bigger danger for Wisconsin because they could leave us holding the bag if it doesn't pan out, or we end up with a data center boom and bust. So we can require these big upfront payments of hundreds of millions of dollars from data centers and use that money to capitalize a public infrastructure bank that will then provide zero interest loans to municipalities and school districts so that we can have things like geothermal heating and cooling our schools, solar panels on the roof, right? Upgrade windows and have cleaner, healthier air and environment for all of us, and lower energy costs for taxpayers, and accelerate our transition to be fully powered by clean renewable energy by 2050, which I think is our great goal for the state.
Um, Absolutely, a lot of our conversations have been centered around data centers, and
Mm-hmm.
honestly, our community is frustrated on both sides because there's a lack of information, but there's also a lot of information and blanket statements about all data centers being
And
hyperscale.
disinformation, I would say,
Yes.
even in this Democratic primary, I'm sorry to say, this is not an issue that should be litigated by meme. This is a very complicated issue, and we focus so much on the data center, the building side of it. But what about the tech side, right? What about the underlying products, social media, the amassing of our data for God knows what purposes, the way that AI will transform our society and our politics and our economy? And I'm worried about both. And no legislator in the state has authored more legislation to regulate the technology product side than I have, taking aim at the way that algorithmic software and AI is being used to raise costs on everything from groceries to concert tickets to rent, protecting our kids from social media and from big tech and the onslaught of screens in our schools, preventing AI from being used to do mass denials of prior authorization when you try to get a procedure covered by your health insurance company. So in all these different ways, we have to not just deal with the data center issue, but we also have to make sure that Wisconsinites are protected, and especially young people, from the ways in which technology can undermine our economy, our politics, our mental health, all the things that we care about.
Absolutely. And currently, a lot of our manufacturers, a lot of our larger businesses are utilizing AI to help them with a full range of tasks, even hiring. It streamlines a lot of things for them. Um, I'm curious what your thoughts are when it comes to that sort of use, if there were to be more regulation on AI, but also on environmental impacts for potential data centers, wouldn't Wisconsin be a good place for that then? Because we could make sure that they were fully regulated to the extent that we wish they would be.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with just saying we're going to pass a moratorium is that you're basically allowing the status quo to continue, because a moratorium is not going to ever get the political support in the legislature to pass. And what the moratorium bill says is it's a moratorium until strong regulations pass. Yet we have a huge amount of political support for the strong regulation bill. So let's pass that immediately in January so that we can stop the unregulated development of data centers. That's the actual position to take if you want to stop what's going on now. And you're absolutely right. Data centers are going to go where they can do what they want. And our energy grid is connected. So if they're building data centers in places like Iowa and Indiana with no regulation, that pollution is not going to stay in those states, right? We're going to suffer from it. And the high energy costs are going to be passed along to us because of the way these regional operators work. Our energy grids are connected. So we're going to get all the downsides of no regulation states, and we'll have no say and no benefit from data centers. And to me, that seems like a lose-lose proposition for Wisconsin.
So a lot of impact that potential data centers would have on Wisconsin is allowing or giving more resources to local municipalities that need it now. If it also has a huge impact on the workforce. So I'm kind of switch gears here from the data centers because I think that pretty much anyone could talk about this forever. But
yeah, good point.
yeah, so reported.
But can I just say one more thing on data centers?
Of course.
I think that one of the most important things is that we are putting local communities in the strongest possible bargaining position vis-a-vis data centers. That's why I want to establish a public negotiating team at the state level that we can basically loan out to any local community that says, you know what, we're interested in having a conversation with data centers. Because once you have strong statewide regulations that say you're going to pay us, you're not getting subsidies, you're going to meet these standards for pollution and for labor, then it's really about how communities are going to benefit, where they're going to go. And if communities can say, no, we don't want you, get out of here, that's great, that's fine. Or communities can say, you know what, not here, but maybe over there. Or we're willing to entertain a conversation with you, but we can't make, the retired dentist, that's the volunteer board chair, be going toe to toe with these $5,000 an hour lawyers from Meta, who does this all day. And so having that public negotiating team, I think is really, really important to making sure that local communities that want data centers with real public involvement, right, not a backroom deal, that they get the maximum benefit that they actually can.
Yeah, absolutely. Making sure those conversations happen, but still maintaining local control for what's best for your community and also consistency across the state, making sure that we're providing a consistent foundation for companies like this that might be interested. We just want to make sure that people are open to having the conversations. That's what we really stress here at the chamber. That's what I appreciate about what we do. So kind of moving into more workforce, we were discussing the impact of AI and potential data centers on our workforce. The Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce reported on the structural workforce problems Wisconsin faces regarding a shrinking workforce. It peaked in 1997 and has declined since, hitting a record low in 2025 with less than 65% of residents working or seeking work. Between 2020 and 2024, Wisconsin lost 40,000 residents under 18, with a projected loss of 95,000 young people in the rest of this decade. On the other hand, Wisconsin's labor market is projected by the Department of Revenue to see 0.2% job gain in 2026, following 0.4 increase in 2025. Short term, these gains are relatively modest, which isn't necessarily indicative of a healed working population, especially because manufacturers across Wisconsin and specifically our region continue to report workforce shortages and difficulty finding skilled laborers. So, given these statistics, in a broad question, what role do you think that the state government and the governor's role more specifically should play in addressing these structural workforce issues?
We face a pretty significant demographic challenge in that the state is aging. If we can't make Wisconsin a place where young people can see themselves building a life, whether that's pursuing higher education, starting a business, beginning their careers, and then eventually building a family, our state is not going to thrive. So I'm actually very concerned about the economy. I think what the attacks on our economic security that we're seeing from the federal government, everything from the healthcare cuts to the illegal tariffs that are harming our farmers and our small businesses and raising the cost of things like housing, are having a devastating impact on communities around the state and the cost of living. But I've been raising the alarm on the demographic challenge and the brain drain that we're seeing for many years, especially on the Joint Finance Committee. I think we need a really smart multi-pronged strategy. It's about affordable housing, making sure that young people can buy a home in their 20s. That should be a given in Wisconsin, that young people who are starting out their careers, finishing college or coming home from the military, they should be able to buy a home in any community in the state. They should have great public schools so that if they want to have kids, there's universal paid family leave that's not dependent on your job, and that early childhood education that is affordable and accessible to everyone. Childcare, by the way, is another huge driver of the loss of workforce capacity, right? Workers leaving the workforce because there just aren't childcare slots available for them, or they're just way too expensive. And, funding for public higher education. Over the last several years, we've seen the closure of more than half a dozen of our University of Wisconsin campuses across the state. And I think disinvesting from education, and particularly public higher education, is a huge mistake for the state. If you talk to employers, as I do every day, all around the state, all different kinds of employers, from farmers to manufacturers to small businesses, you'll find that people do really want to have skilled workforce, but it's really, really hard when people are leaving the state, when childcare is unavailable, and when the training isn't available and affordable for people. Another piece of this that I think is really important is healthcare. The cost of healthcare for employers is punishing. Healthcare premiums are skyrocketing. It's very unpredictable. I was speaking to a teacher in Superior who told me that their premiums increased this year 38%. So do you think any teachers in that school district are going to be getting a raise? No, they're going to be getting a huge pay cut, because there is no way that the district, which has been, of course, starved of resources for many years by Republicans in Madison, can absorb that on their own. That's why my healthcare plan, I think, is going to help spur economic development and reverse this trend of young people leaving the state. When you open up the state health insurance plan to let anybody buy in and be part of that big state employee pool, you're giving them high quality, competitively priced, nonprofit health insurance, where the money is actually going into the care and not into the pockets of some executive in New York. And we're helping reduce uncompensated care so we can drive down premium costs for everybody, no matter who your insurer is. And we're helping free people from having to be married to a particular job to actually have health insurance coverage. And so you would be free to maybe start that small business, or to take time out of the workforce to, care for a loved one or go back to school. Or maybe at the other end of the career spectrum, maybe you can actually retire at 62, even though you're not eligible for Medicare, because you'll be able to bridge that gap with healthcare. And to me, that is very, very important. And my plan is very different from what the other candidates are offering. They're not talking at all about healthcare coverage using the state pool, which is working very well for state employees, to create economic freedom and the kind of economic growth and possibility that I think all of us want in our society.
Mhm. It's fascinating how Wisconsin's problems just translate to be business community problems. And you wouldn't think that healthcare would be at the forefront of all of these business owners in our region, but it absolutely is. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess because healthcare is such an impactful aspect of the workforce issue, If you could prioritize one workforce solution, you mentioned childcare, education, workforce training programs, immigration, you mentioned before, but also talent attraction, or any others, which would have the biggest impact, and which do you think you would be most likely to prioritize as governor?
Well, I don't think we can pick just one. I think we do have to have a multi-pronged strategy, and we are going to have the opportunity to make real meaningful change for the first time in a generation if we have a Democratic nominee who can win the election and help deliver the state assembly, and who has the political willingness to use power to get things done for people. We've seen how the Trump regime uses power to hurt people and to take away access to things like education and nutrition support and healthcare. I don't think Democrats have the luxury of being afraid to use power to try to help stop the bleeding and make people's lives better in communities around the state. But I will just say, I think childcare is the area where the state has invested the least. We've had functionally for most of the state's history $0 invested in early childhood education. And as somebody who, as the mom and stepmom of 5 kids, that range in age now from 25 to almost 5, this is really personal for me. And I talk to people all over the state, employers, workers, parents, grandparents, who say, I'd love to be back in the workforce, but I can't afford it. We can't find a slot. I got on a waiting list before I even got pregnant, and I still didn't have childcare till my kid was 2. Our tuition is going up 20%. This is madness. The idea that we're going to ration access to childcare and early childhood education when 90% of brain development happens for children based on your wealth or your job or what community you happen to live in doesn't make economic sense. We recognize that there is a broad societal and economic value to having universal public education. We want all kids to be educated. You never know where the next Einstein's going to come from. It helps us all to have an educated population. Why, during the most critical years of birth to 5, do we say, hey, parents, you're on your own? Congrats on the baby. Now give us $100,000 before your kid hits kindergarten. And then we wonder why young people aren't having kids. I know so many families that would love to have a kid or love to have a second kid, but they can't because childcare is too expensive. What a horrible statement about the society that we've built when people can't afford to build the family that they want. Public investment in childcare, I have a detailed plan to solve this problem. We can make Wisconsin shares universal, pull down hundreds of millions of dollars in federal money to help cover the cost, and we can pay for universal early childhood education that caps tuition at 7% of a family's income per kid, which is way less than most people are paying now. And we can pay for this by legalizing cannabis and taxing and regulating it. So to me, this is an easy can do that helps families. It helps address the demographic challenge that you're facing. It helps set kids up for success and helps eliminate some of those opportunity gaps that we see emerging even, as early as kindergarten. And it helps our workforce and our economy.
Absolutely. A lot of people in our area, or just people in Wisconsin, I think, struggle with finding these overarching solutions because they don't understand how the cost will be compensated. And so seeing that as part of the plan is refreshing. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that part. Before we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't touched on or that you would like to re-emphasize that you think Eau Claire businesses should know about your candidacy?
Well, I think I'd like people to know that I have built the broadest coalition to support my campaign. I've been endorsed by Wisconsin's Teachers Union, WEAC, which is the largest organization to endorse in this race for anyone. I've also built the most endorsements of any candidate in this race from current and former elected officials and community leaders in every part of the state. And I've also, earned the support of former Lieutenant Governor Barbara Lawton, the only statewide elected official to endorse in this race. We face a lot of challenges at this moment: economic challenges, social and political challenges, real challenges that make this a kind of a scary time to be an American. when fundamental things that we tried to take for granted, like the rule of law and freedom of speech, are being undermined every single day by our federal government. We need a governor who can help protect us from those harms. But this is also a moment of real opportunity for Wisconsin, where we're going to have almost certainly a Democratic state Senate and an assembly that's really close one way or the other. And if we have a strong, thoughtful, independent governor who cares about doing the right thing, not doing the easy political thing, we can turn this into a transformational moment for our state. We can raise wages, we can lower costs, we can fund public education and have the best public schools in the country again, and we can protect and renew our democracy and our rights and freedoms. That's the campaign that I'm building. I'm really proud to have broad support from everybody, from Republicans and former Republican staffers and county party officials, to moderates and independents across the state, to Democrats and liberals. That's the kind of governor that I'm going to be, a governor for everyone. That's the kind of coalition that I'm going to continue building as I have throughout my career. And I hope I can earn the votes of your listeners on August 11th and again on November 3rd. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Senator Royce, thank you again for taking the time to join us and share your perspective on the issues facing Wisconsin and the greater Chippewa Valley. Here at the Eau Claire Chamber, we very much appreciate your willingness to participate in this series and engage directly with our business community. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for an episode of the Ballot Brief. As a reminder, the purpose of this series is to provide a platform for candidates ahead of the August 11th primary rather than endorse. Be sure to check out other candidate interviews on this playlist and visit the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce website for additional voting and candidate information and resources related to the August 11th primary election. And thank you again to our media sponsor, Home Tech by Mosaic. Thank you for listening.